The morning Stella Holloway rode into Harlan County seat alone, with nothing but a leather satchel full of papers and a jaw set harder than the Arizona bedrock beneath her horse's hooves. Every man in that courthouse square turned to look at her, and then quickly looked away, because there was something in her eyes that made a person feel ashamed for whatever small meanness they had most recently committed. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Harlan, Arizona Territory, was the kind of place that smelled like horse dung, ambition, and barely concealed corruption in equal measure. The courthouse sat at the top of a wide dirt road lined with hitching posts and a hardware store that also sold whiskey on the side, which told you most of what you needed to know about the priorities of the people who lived there. The sky above it was the deep, uncompromising blue of the Southwest in October, and the cottonwood trees along the main road had gone gold at their edges, their leaves trembling in a wind that carried the first real chill of the coming season. Stella was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 4 months and 3 days, though she had stopped counting after the first 2 months because counting made it worse. Her husband, Robert Holloway, had died of a fever that came on fast and went faster, leaving her alone on 160 acres of grazing land she had helped him build from nothing, with a small herd of cattle, a horse, a dog named Pepper, and a son named Thomas who was 6 years old and currently in the care of her neighbor, Mabel Greer, a kind woman who smelled like cinnamon and didn't ask questions Stella couldn't yet answer. The land was the thing. It had always been the thing. Robert had filed the original deed under the Homestead Act of 1862, and for 3 years they had proved up on it together, working it, building on it, sinking their hands and their futures into the red Arizona dirt, until it belonged to them in the way that only hard labor can make a thing yours. But Robert had died before the final transfer of the full deed title had been completed, and now there was a man named Clarence Drummond, who had apparently decided that a widow with a dead husband's incomplete paperwork was a fine and easy target. Drummond ran the Harlan Land and Cattle Company, which was a grand name for what was essentially a machine for taking land from people who couldn't fight back. He had done it to the Ray's family 2 years ago, had done it to old Luther Pinney the year before that, and now he had filed a competing claim on Stella's 160 acres, citing a technicality in the recording of the original deed that his lawyer, a slick man named Gideon Farris, had apparently manufactured out of thin air and the cooperative silence of the county recorder, a man named Harold Weeks who sweated whenever someone looked at him directly. Stella had read every paper in Robert's satchel 3 times. She had ridden to the office of the only other lawyer in Harlan, a decent but timid man named Cecil Porter, who had told her the situation was complicated, which she understood to mean he was afraid of Drummond. She had written letters to the Territorial Land Office in Prescott and received back replies that were polite and non-committal in the way of bureaucratic letters everywhere and every time. She had talked to her neighbor Hector Rays, whose family had lost their land to Drummond, and he had told her with sad eyes that the county seat hearings were where Drummond did his real work, because the judge who presided over land disputes in Harlan was a man named Avery Colt, who had been eating Sunday dinners at Drummond's house for the past 5 years. She knew all of this. She rode into Harlan anyway, because the land was Thomas's land. It was her land. It was where Robert was buried, out behind the cottonwood tree near the creek, and she was not going to let Clarence Drummond put a cattle operation on top of her husband's grave. The courthouse was a 2-story adobe building with a wooden facade nailed to the front of it to make it look more official, which was the kind of architectural deception that Stella had always found quietly funny and now found not funny at all. She tied her mare, a steady roan named Clara, to the hitching post outside, smoothed her dark skirt with both hands, picked up the satchel, and walked up the steps. The hearing room was on the ground floor, past a narrow hallway that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. When she pushed open the door, she found it already occupied. Clarence Drummond was there, seated at a table on the left side of the room with Gideon Farris beside him. Drummond was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had probably once been handsome and had curdled into something self-satisfied and heavy. He was 60 years old and dressed in the good wool suit of a man who wanted you to know he had money, and he looked at Stella the way a man looks at a minor inconvenience he has already decided not to think too hard about. Ferris was worse, in the way that lawyers who do dirty work for powerful men are always worse than the men themselves, because they add a layer of practiced righteousness over the corruption that makes it harder to name directly. He was thin and pale, with wire-rimmed spectacles and quick, darting eyes, and he smiled at Stella when she came in with the particular smile of a man who has already won and is enjoying the waiting. Judge Avery Colt was not yet there. The court recorder, a young man named Billy Sutton who appeared genuinely nervous, was shuffling papers at a small desk near the window. Harold Weeks, the county recorder, was seated in the gallery, sweating exactly as Hector Reyes had predicted. Stella walked to the table on the right side of the room, set down her satchel, sat down, and folded her hands on top of it. She looked at neither Drummond nor Ferris. She looked at the window, at the blue Arizona sky beyond it, and she breathed slowly and carefully, the way she had learned to breathe when things were very bad and falling apart, the way she had breathed when Robert had been burning with fever in the middle of the night, and there was nothing she could do but stay beside him and be calm. Judge Colt came in 20 minutes late, which Stella suspected was calculated. He was a lean, weathered man in his mid-50s with a thin mustache and the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years in bright sunlight. He took his seat at the bench without looking at anyone in particular and told Billy Sutton to call the matter. Billy Sutton called it, the matter of the competing land claim on Parcel 7, Section 4 of the Harlan County Survey, between the Holloway Estate and the Harlan Land and Cattle Company. And then Ferris stood up and began to talk. He talked for a long time. He talked about the original recording error in the deed filing, which he described as a material defect. He talked about the legal requirements for the completion of a homestead claim under the Homestead Act. He talked about the requirement for the claimant to be present and able to manage the claimed land. And he gestured at Stella in a way that managed to convey, without saying anything technically objectionable, that a widow with a small child was unlikely to be able to manage 160 acres of grazing land. He laid his papers on the table with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times before, and when he was done, he sat down and Drummond nodded at him the way a man nods at a good hunting dog. Stella stood up. She said, "Your Honor, my name is Stella Holloway. My late husband, Robert Holloway, filed the original deed on this parcel in 1879. I have here the original filing receipt from the county recorder's office, the land survey completed by Mr. James Whitmore in the same year, the certificate of improvements filed in 1880, and the notice of continued occupancy filed in 1881. I also have a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Prescott acknowledging receipt of all materials and noting no defect in the original filing." She placed each document on the table as she named it, one after another, squaring them carefully. "The alleged recording error that Mr. Ferris describes," she continued, keeping her voice even, "is a single transposition in the parcel number as it appears in the county record book. The correct parcel number appears on every other document in this filing, including the survey and the improvement certificate. The error is a clerical one. It is in the county's own record book, and it was not present in the original filing. I would suggest to the court that if there is an error in the county recorder's book, the remedy is to correct the county recorder's book." She looked at Harold Weeks when she said that. Harold Weeks's face went the color of old cream. Judge Colt looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change. He said, "Mrs. Holloway, are you represented by counsel?" "I am not, Your Honor." "I see." He made a small sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a dismissal, but was in the neighborhood of both. "Mr. Ferris, your response to the county record argument." Ferris rose with the ease of a man who had prepared for this. He said that the error in the county record was immaterial because the filing itself had been incomplete at the time of Mr. Holloway's death, that the homestead claim required proof of continued management and operation of the claimed land by the claimant, and that as Mrs. Holloway had no male head of household and no clear ability to demonstrate ongoing operation of the land as a viable agricultural enterprise, the claim had effectively lapsed. He said no male head of household, and let it sit in the air of the room like a stone dropped in still water. Stella felt something cold move through her. Not fear exactly. Rage, but the cold kind, the kind that makes you very quiet and very precise. She stood again and said, "Your Honor, there is no provision in the Homestead Act of 1862 that requires a male head of household to maintain a valid claim. A widow inherits her husband's claim. I have been operating the land continuously. I have cattle on the land. I have a house on the land. I have been there on that land every single day for the 4 months since my husband passed, and I have the records to show it." She pulled out one more document. It was a simple ledger page, her own handwriting, showing the dates of cattle sales and supply purchases and the name of the buyer and the amount, covering the past 4 months in plain, careful columns. "This is not a lapsed claim," she said. "This is an active, operational homestead, and Mr. Drummond's competing claim has no legal basis that does not depend either on a clerical error that should be corrected or on a legal argument that has no foundation in the statute." There was a silence in the room, and then the door at the back of the courthouse opened. Everyone turned. The man who came through that door was tall, and he moved the way men move when they have spent most of their lives outdoors, with an easy, unhurried economy of motion that was somehow both relaxed and intensely alert, like a person who has learned that stillness and readiness are the same thing. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, with dark hair that was just slightly too long under a battered tan hat, and the kind of face that had been made better rather than worse by weather and time, with a strong jaw and dark eyes that took in the room in a single sweep, and settled on Stella with an expression that was impossible to read in the half-second before he schooled it into something neutral. He was wearing a worn leather vest over a dark shirt, trail-dusty trousers tucked into boots that had seen considerable hard use, and there was the unmistakable evidence of hard riding in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, the kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from too many miles covered too fast. He walked up the aisle of the small hearing room, his boots sounding on the wooden floor, and he came to stand beside the table where Stella was standing, and he set his hat on the table and said, in a voice pitched just right for the room, calm and clear and carrying an easy certainty that Stella had not expected, "Sorry I'm late, Your Honor. I had trouble on the road from Tucson. Wesley Maddox. I'm Mrs. Holloway's husband." Every atom of air in the room rearranged itself. Stella went very still. She felt his arm brush hers as he stood beside her, felt the warmth of him, the solidity, and she looked up at his profile because he was looking at the judge, and she saw nothing there that gave her any useful information, nothing that told her who this man was or what in the world he was doing, and she thought very clearly and very fast. "He is a liar, he is a stranger, he is standing next to me in a courtroom claiming to be my husband, and I have no idea why, and if I correct him right now everything falls apart." She thought about Drummond's face when Ferris had said no male head of household. She thought about Robert's grave behind the cottonwood tree. She thought about Thomas. She did not correct him. She turned back to face the judge and she said nothing, which was the same as agreeing, which was the same as lying, and she did not think about that right now. She thought about the land. Judge Colt was looking at Wesley Maddox with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the bland confidence of a man who expected no challenges to something more cautious, more watchful. He said, "Mr. Maddox, you are claiming to be the husband of the claimant. "I am her husband," Wesley said. He said it with a flat simplicity that was more convincing than any performance would have been. "We were married in Tucson, Your Honor, in June of this year, after the passing of her first husband. I've been working the Rafter Cross cattle drive out of Texas for the past 3 months, which is why I've been slow getting here. But I'm here now, and I'd like to hear the rest of this proceeding if that's all right." He pulled out the chair next to Stella's and sat down, and he rested one hand on the table with the same ease with which he had entered the room, and he looked at Judge Colt with the patient attention of a man who had nothing to hide. Ferris had risen from his seat, his quick eyes darting between Wesley and Stella. He said, "Your Honor, I must object to this late entry. There has been no mention of a husband in any of the prior correspondence or filings." "That's because the filings were all done in my wife's name," Wesley said, "as is her right. The claim is under the Homestead Act in the name of Stella Holloway." "That's correct. I don't see how the existence of a husband after the fact of the original filing changes the legal basis of the claim, but I'll admit I'm not a lawyer." He said, "I'm not a lawyer," in a way that managed to make lawyers sound like a thing a man would be mildly embarrassed by. Drummond, who had been silent through all of this, leaned forward in his chair. He was looking at Wesley Maddox the way a man looks at something that has just appeared in his path where there was clear ground before. He said, "Colt." It was just the name, and it was said the way a man says a name to remind another man of their arrangement, quietly and with certainty, and Judge Colt heard it and his jaw tightened very slightly. But Judge Colt was not stupid. He had been in the business of doing favors for Clarence Drummond for 5 years, and he had gotten away with it because there was never anyone in his courtroom who was watching closely enough, or credible enough, or loud enough to make it costly. He looked now at Wesley Maddox, and something in the quality of Maddox's stillness, the specific quality of a man who was not afraid of him and was watching everything, made Judge Colt think about what it would cost him if this went wrong in a visible way. He said, "Mr. Ferris, the court will take a 15-minute recess. I'd like to review the filings." He took the papers. He went into his back office. The court recorder, Billy Sutton, found something urgent to do near the window. Harold Weeks had gone the color of old chalk. Stella sat very quietly beside the man who had just claimed to be her husband, and she was aware of him with a physical acuity that she did not know what to do with, the warmth of him, the smell of horse and trail dust, and something else under that, something cleaner like cedar. She said very quietly, not looking at him, "I don't know you." "No," he said, equally quiet. "You don't? Then why, I heard about your situation," he said, "in Tucson from Hector Reyes's brother. He said a woman was riding alone to Harlan to fight Drummond, and she didn't have a lawyer and Drummond had the judge. I thought I could help." She turned her head just enough to look at him then. He was looking straight ahead at the judge's empty bench with the same calm, patient expression. Up close she could see the lines around his eyes, the specific quality of exhaustion in the set of his shoulders that he was not quite successfully concealing, the small scar along the edge of his jaw that she couldn't help noticing because it was right there. She said, "You rode from Tucson to do this for a stranger." "I rode fast," he said with a slight smile that appeared briefly at the corner of his mouth and then was gone. "I was almost not in time." "You were almost not in time," she agreed. "Why does it matter to you? You don't know me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew men like Drummond growing up. My father lost his land to a man just like him, in Kansas. I was 14. It's not something you forget." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she looked away, and they sat in the very particular silence of two strangers who have just entered into a conspiracy together. And Stella was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been aware of it in 4 months, which she chose not to examine. From across the room, Clarence Drummond was watching them with cold, flat eyes. Judge Colt came back in 8 minutes, not 15. He sat down at the bench, shuffled the papers once, and said, in a voice that was carefully neutral, "Having reviewed the complete filing, the court finds that the recording error in the county record book is a clerical error originating with the county recorder's office, and not with the original filing. The original deed filing by Robert Holloway in 1879 is found to be complete and valid. The competing claim filed by the Harlan Land and Cattle Company is dismissed for lack of legal basis. He brought down his gavel with a sound that rang in the small room like a proclamation. Drummond's face went very dark. He said, "Colt," and then caught himself, because Billy Sutton was writing every word in his record book with the slightly elevated attentiveness of a young man who had been watching injustice happen in this room for 2 years and was paying very close attention today. Ferris was already gathering his papers, his face professionally composed over whatever rage or disappointment he felt, and he murmured something to Drummond that Stella could not hear, and Drummond stood and straightened his coat and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. Stella sat for a moment without moving. Then she let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding since she woke up that morning, since she saddled Clara in the pre-dawn dark and rode out alone under a sky full of stars, since 4 months ago when Robert had stopped breathing and she had sat beside him in the quiet, and understood that everything now was going to be much harder than it had been. And the breath went out of her and she put both hands flat on the table and just breathed for a moment, in and out, the land still hers. Thomas's land still Thomas's, Robert's grave undisturbed. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very steady, which was a thing she was proud of. Wesley Maddox said, "The land is yours, Mrs. Holloway." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something careful and genuine at the same time, as if he was trying very hard not to be more than he had offered to be, which was just a stranger helping a stranger. She said, "We need to talk about what you told that judge." "Yes," he said, "we do." They walked out of the courthouse together into the blue October air, and Stella noticed that he held the door for her without making a production of it, a small natural gesture. And she noticed that she noticed this and made herself stop noticing things about him. Outside, the cottonwood trees were still doing their golden trembling in the wind, and the main road of Harlan was its usual dusty, organized chaos of horses and wagons and men conducting the business of a cattle territory in the early 1880s. And Stella turned to face Wesley Maddox in the middle of the courthouse steps with her satchel under her arm and her roan mare watching them from the hitching post with wise brown eyes. She said, "You lied to a judge." "Yes," he said. "That is perjury." "Technically, I think it might be," he said, and there was a slight, very slight quality to his voice that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, like a man who knows the situation is serious and is not disrespecting the seriousness, but also cannot pretend that there is not something absurd about standing on courthouse steps being calmly informed of his legal liabilities by the woman he just committed perjury to help. "You could have just testified that you knew about the land," she said. "You could have been a witness." "A witness doesn't have the same weight as a husband," he said simply, "not with a judge like that." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was directly behind him and she had to squint, which she resented slightly because it meant she could not see his expression as clearly as she wanted to. She said, "I could have corrected you." "You could have," he agreed, "but I didn't." "No," he said, "you didn't." The implication of this lay between them, and Stella was honest enough with herself to not pretend she didn't understand what it meant. She had made a choice. She had let the lie stand. That made her responsible for it too, and she was not a person who flinched from responsibility. She said, "What is it that you want, Mr. Maddox? I need to understand your intentions." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I don't want anything, Mrs. Holloway. I came here to help and I did, and I'm glad of it. I'll ride back to wherever I ride back to, and that's the end of it if that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," she said, and then stopped, because it actually was about what she wanted and she should not pretend otherwise, but she was also not sure yet what she wanted and she needed to think. She said, "I have a son. His name is Thomas. He is 6 years old. I have a ranch that needs to be operated. I have a dead husband I am still grieving and a stranger who told a judge he was my husband, and I need to think carefully about all of that." "That seems right," he said. You are being very agreeable for a man who just complicated my life considerably. I am also genuinely tired, he said. I rode hard to get here. Do you think there is anywhere in this town I could get a meal and somewhere to sleep that isn't the ground? Stella looked at him for another moment, and despite everything, despite the strangeness and the complication and the fact that she was still sorting through what had just happened, she felt something that was close to laughter move through her, a startled, helpless, genuine thing, and she pressed her lips together to contain it because she was in the middle of a very serious conversation. She said, "There is a boarding house on the west end of Main Street. Mrs. Alcott runs it. She is reasonable and she doesn't ask about your business, which I expect you will appreciate." "I do appreciate it," he said, and then he put his hat back on his head and looked at her and said, "Will you still be in town tomorrow, Mrs. Holloway?" "I'll ride out in the morning," she said. "Then I wonder if I might impose on you for one more conversation before you do." She looked at him. He looked back, and in the full light outside the courthouse, away from the weighted air of the hearing room, she could see him more clearly now. The dark eyes were direct and calm. The tired lines around them were real. There was nothing in his face that she could read as calculation or performance, and Stella had a good eye for both of those things. She said, "Breakfast. Mrs. Alcott serves at 7. She rode to the dry goods store, bought the supplies she needed, and then went to the boarding house herself, because the hour was too late to make the full ride home, and she had arranged to sleep there as well. And she lay awake for a while in the small, clean room with its single window looking out at the dark street, listening to the sounds of a frontier town settling into its evening routine. And she thought about Wesley Maddox and about the land and about what came next, and she thought about Robert, which she did every night, the specific shape of the grief of him, the particular absence, and she let herself feel it fully the way she had learned to do, not flinching from it because flinching made it last longer. Then she thought about the land, still hers, still Thomas's, and she slept. In the morning she came down to breakfast at 7:05 to find Wesley Maddox already at the table, looking considerably less dusty than the day before, his dark hair still damp at the edges from washing, and he stood when she came in, which she had not expected, and she sat down across from him and Mrs. Alcott, a round, cheerful woman who had seen everything and formed opinions about none of it, brought coffee and biscuits and eggs without being asked. They talked. This was the part that surprised Stella, because she had expected it to be awkward, had expected the strangeness of the previous day to create a constraint between them, but instead they talked with an ease that felt almost familiar, as if they had practiced it somewhere she couldn't remember. He told her about himself in the matter-of-fact way of a man who is not trying to impress anyone. He was from Abilene, Kansas originally. His father had homesteaded there, had lost the land to a cattle company when Wesley was 14, and after that Wesley had gone to work as a ranch hand at 15, had worked his way up to trail hand, had led drives from Texas to Abilene and back over the past decade. He was 31 years old. He had been passing through Tucson when he had met Ernesto Reyes, Hector's younger brother, who had told him about Stella's situation with the particular passionate eloquence of a young man who had watched his own family lose everything to the same man 2 years before. "Ernesto said you were the most stubborn woman in 3 territories," Wesley said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made it clear he meant this admiringly. "Ernesto Reyes is 20 years old and has opinions about everything," Stella said. "He said you'd say something like that too." She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the east window of the boarding house dining room, yellow and slanted, catching the steam rising from the coffee cups. She said, "What do you do now?" "Where are you going?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about that. I've been moving cattle for 16 years. I've been good at it. I've saved some money. I've been thinking for a while about whether I want to keep doing it." He paused. "I don't have land, Mrs. Holloway. I don't have a house. What I have is a horse, a saddle, a good rope, and about $400 saved up. which is a fine thing, but it's not the same as having somewhere to be. Stella understood this with a clarity that was almost physical, because it was exactly what she had heard in 100 different iterations from men who had worked the cattle trails their whole lives and arrived at their 30s without roots. She said, "You are a cowboy who wants to stop riding." "I am a cowboy who wants something to ride toward instead of just ride," he said. She looked at her coffee. She looked at him. She said very carefully, "I have 160 acres of grazing land and a small herd and no one to help me run it. I have a 6-year-old son who needs a man in his life who is worth something, not just any man. I am not in a position to be making promises to anyone right now, and I want you to understand that." "I understand that," he said. "Robert has been gone 4 months. I am not," she stopped, chose her words. "I am not ready for anything. I am not asking for anything," he said. "I am saying that if you needed a hand on your ranch, I know cattle, I know land, I am not afraid of hard work, and I have no particular place else to be." Stella looked at him for a long, measuring moment. She thought about what she knew of him, which was that he had ridden hard and fast from Tucson on the word of a young man who told him a stranger needed help, and that he had walked into a courtroom and told a lie on her behalf without asking for anything in return, and that he had stood beside her at that table with the quiet competence of someone who understands exactly what they're doing and exactly why. She said, "I would be able to pay you a hand's wages, $30 a month, and room and board." "That's fair," he said. "You will sleep in the bunkhouse. There is only me and Thomas in the house." "Of course," he said. "And we don't speak of what happened in that courtroom," she said. "To anyone. What you said in there stays in there." He nodded. "And I need you to understand," she said, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at him directly because she needed him to actually hear this, "that I am the person in charge of that land. It is my land. I make the decisions about it. I will hear your opinion when I ask for it and sometimes when I don't, but the decisions are mine." He looked at her and he said with complete simplicity, "Yes, Mrs. Holloway." They rode out together that morning, Stella on Clara and Wesley on his horse, a big gray gelding he called Cinder, and the road back to the Holloway ranch took them through 15 miles of red rock scrub and open grassland that was exactly the kind of country that made a person feel very small and very aware in the same breath. The vast sky overhead and the jagged line of the mountains to the north and the clean bite of the October air. They rode mostly in silence, which was comfortable rather than tense, the particular silence of two people who have already said what needed to be said and are content to let the rest wait. And Stella found herself noticing things about the way he rode, the ease of him on the horse, the way he looked at the land as they passed through it, attentively, like someone reading a text they are genuinely interested in. When they came over the last rise and the Holloway place came into view below them, she felt the same thing she always felt at that moment, a kind of settling, a deep recognition that was like coming back to herself. The house was small and solid, built of adobe with a wooden porch across the front. The barn was bigger than the house, which was typical of cattle country, and beyond it the land ran out flat and wide toward the creek, and the cattle were visible in the far pasture, small dark shapes moving slowly in the morning light. Robert was buried behind the cottonwood tree near the creek, where he had asked to be buried, and she could see the white cross she had put there from where they stopped on the rise. She said quietly, "That is where my husband is." Wesley looked at the cross for a moment. He said, "He chose a good place." "He loved that tree," she said. "We used to sit there in the evenings." She rode down. Mabel Greer was on the porch when they arrived, and Thomas was beside her, and when Thomas saw Stella he came off that porch like a small cannon, running across the yard with his arms out, and Stella swung down off Clara and caught him and lifted him and held him the way she always held him when she came back from anywhere, tight, and for a moment too long, her face in his hair. He smelled like cinnamon, which meant Mabel had been baking. He said, "Did you win, Mama?" "Yes," she said. "We won. The land is ours." He leaned back in her arms to look at her with his father's eyes, dark and serious, and then he noticed Wesley Maddox standing a few feet away holding Cinder's reins, and his face went very alert and curious in the way of 6-year-olds who have not yet learned to disguise their interest in strangers. He said, "Who is that?" Stella set him down on his feet and said, "That is Mr. Maddox. He helped us in town. He is going to be working on the ranch for a while." Thomas looked at Wesley with the frank evaluation of a child. Wesley crouched down to his level, which put them at eye and said, "How do you do?" Thomas said, "Do you know how to rope?" "I do," Wesley said. "Can you teach me?" "Thomas," Stella said, but Wesley smiled, a real smile, easy and warm, and said, "If your mother says it's all right, I'll teach you." Thomas looked at his mother. Stella looked at Wesley. Something moved through her that she did not name because it was too complicated for a name and she was too tired for complications, so she just said, "We'll see." Mabel Greer had observed all of this from the porch with the calm attentiveness of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of things when they are beginning. She was 60 years old, small and round, with silver hair and the permanently warm expression of someone who was genuinely interested in the world and almost never surprised by it. She waited until Wesley had taken both horses to the barn, and then she appeared silently beside Stella and said, in a tone that communicated many things at once, "He's very tall." "He is a ranch hand," Stella said. "He held the barn door for the horses," Mabel said. "That's a good sign." "Mabel." "I'm just noting things," Mabel said, and patted Stella on the arm and then went back inside to finish her biscuits. The days settled into a rhythm, as days on a working ranch must do. Wesley knew cattle, exactly as he had said, and he knew the work of land in the way of someone who had grown up on it and spent his life attending to it even when it didn't belong to him, which Stella respected without remarking on. He was up before her every morning, which she discovered by accident the second day when she rose before first light to find the stove in the barn already hot and cinder already fed, and the water trough in the east pasture cleared of the ice that formed overnight this time of year. He worked without needing to be told what needed doing, which was either a sign of competence or the kind of overstepping that Stella had been specific about, and she paid attention carefully for the first week to determine which it was. At the end of the first week, she concluded that it was competence, not overstepping, because every decision he made was a decision she would have made herself, just made earlier, and because when he was uncertain about something he asked, directly and without embarrassment, which she found she respected. He was good with Thomas, in the measured, unhurried way that suggested he had spent time around children without being sentimental about it. He taught Thomas to throw a rope in the third week, in the yard after supper, and Stella watched from the kitchen window while the boy tried and failed and tried again, while Wesley adjusted his grip and his stance with patient hands and told him things she could not hear through the glass, and Thomas's face went through a complete cycle of frustration and determination and pure delight when the loop finally fell over the fence post the way it was supposed to. That night after Thomas was in bed, Stella was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, which was her evening ritual, and Wesley came and sat on the porch steps with his own cup, which had become his habit, and they talked the way they had started to talk in the evenings, about the land, about the cattle, about the things that needed doing and the things that had been done, and then sometimes beyond those things, into easier territory. She told him about Robert that evening, which was the first time she had spoken about Robert to anyone other than Mabel. She told him how they had met, how Robert had come through Kansas on his way to the territories and had stopped at her father's farm for 2 days and had written to her for 6 months before she agreed to come to Arizona with him, how they had built the place together, the house and the barn and the fences, how Robert had a capacity for patience that she had spent years envying and eventually come to understand was not patience exactly but something more like faith. A certainty that things would work out if you kept working. Wesley listened to all of this without interrupting, which was a thing she had not experienced from a man in some time. When she was done, he said, "He sounds like someone worth missing." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "he was." There was a quiet between them that was different from previous quiets, softer at the edges, and Stella looked out at the dark land and thought about how strange it was that a stranger who had walked into her life through a lie was sitting on her porch feeling more familiar to her than most people she had known for years, and she did not know what to do with that except let it be. 2 weeks after Wesley arrived, Clarence Drummond rode out to the ranch. He came in the middle of the morning with 2 men behind him, his regular riders, and pulled up in the yard without being invited, which was a statement in itself. Stella came out of the house when she heard the horses, and Wesley came around the corner of the barn carrying a coil of wire and a pair of pliers, and they stood together in the yard looking up at Drummond on his horse. Drummond looked older out here, away from the authority of the courthouse, and his face was doing something complicated with itself, a performance of calm over an anger that Stella could see in his eyes as clearly as she could see everything else about him. He said, "Mrs. Holloway, I've come to make you an offer." Stella said, "You've come to my property without an invitation, Mr. Drummond." "I'm making a courtesy call," he said, the words slightly too clipped to be convincing. "I'll pay you fair market value for this land plus 20% above. That's a generous offer and you know it." "I'm not selling," she said. "You're running this place with a single hand and a small herd," he said. "Be practical about this. I can offer you enough money to set yourself and that boy up somewhere comfortable." "I'm not selling." His eyes moved to Wesley and something in his expression sharpened. He said, "Your husband seems to have appeared out of nowhere, Maddox. People talk about that in town." Wesley said very calmly, "People talk about a lot of things in town, Mr. Drummond. That doesn't make them worth listening to." Drummond looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I've been making business in this territory for 20 years. I know every deed and every claim and every man who's ever put a fence post in the ground from here to the Colorado River. The name Wesley Maddox doesn't appear in any of it." "I'm not from this territory," Wesley said. "Kansas, originally. Trail work mostly. I'm settled now." "Settled," Drummond repeated. The word sounded like a doubt in his mouth. Stella said, "Mr. Drummond, I've told you I'm not selling. That's my final answer. Please get off my property." He looked at her and the anger was very close to the surface now, barely dressed in the performance of civility, and he said, "You think you won something in that courthouse. What you did was make an enemy, and that's a different kind of thing." "Is that a threat?" Stella said. He said, "It's advice," and turned his horse and rode out with his men behind him. Stella stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats had faded, and then she let out a long breath and looked at Wesley, who was standing with the coil of wire still in his hands, watching the road where Drummond had gone. She said, "He's going to keep coming." "Probably," Wesley said. He looked at her. "He said it to make you afraid. A man who's going to actually do something doesn't usually announce it first." "Robert would have said the same thing," she said, and then was a little surprised at herself for saying it, because she had not meant to. Wesley looked at her steadily and said, "Your husband was right about a lot of things." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away and said they should get back to the fence line, and they did, and neither of them mentioned Drummond for the rest of the day. But the threat was a real thing, and Stella knew it, and she thought about it in the evenings, turning it over, trying to understand what form it would take and how to be ready for it. Drummond had lost in the courthouse, which meant he would not try that approach again, not directly. What he had left was the kind of slow pressure that men like him were good at, drying up supplies from vendors who depended on his business, blocking access to the cattle market through his connections with the buyers in Harlan, making the ranch harder to operate without doing anything that could be named. She talked to Wesley about it one evening on the porch, laying it out in plain terms, and he listened with his characteristic stillness, his coffee in his hands, looking out at the dark. He said, "The market problem is the real one. You've got cattle to sell, and if he blocks the buyers in Harlan, you need another market." "The nearest other market is Tucson," she said. "That's a 2-day drive." "It is," he said. "But I know the buyers in Tucson. I've done drives through there for years. I could write some letters. Make some introductions." He paused. "If you want," she looked at him, "you would do that." "I'm a ranch hand," he said. Getting your cattle to market is part of the job. She thought about what he was not saying, which was that he had connections and experience that she did not have, that the world of cattle buyers and trail bosses and livestock markets was still, in 1882, a world in which a woman's name and a woman's voice carried less weight than a man's, not through any law but through 1,000 accumulated customs and assumptions that were as real as a fence line, and that having someone with his knowledge in her corner was not a small thing. She said, "Send the letters." He sent them. The letters produced results within 2 weeks, as he had expected they would, because Wesley Maddox had apparently spent 16 years building a reputation for reliability and fair dealing with every cattle buyer between Kansas and southern Arizona, and his name opened doors that Stella's name would not have opened, not because she was less capable, but because the world was built the way it was built, and she took the opportunity while being clear-eyed about the injustice of needing it. The cattle buyer from Tucson, a man named Cruz, rode out to the ranch in November and made Stella an offer that was fair and straightforward, and she negotiated it up by 8%, which Cruz accepted with the bemused respect of a man who had not expected to be outmaneuvered by anyone. After Cruz rode away with the deal agreed and Stella went to find Wesley to tell him, she found him in the barn doing the particular kind of quiet work that reveals a person's character, the unfussy, patient maintenance of things, oiling the saddle leather, checking the horse's feet, the work no one sees but that keeps everything from falling apart. He looked up when she came in. She said Cruz agreed to the terms. A real smile crossed his face, warm and genuine, and he said, "Good. He'd better have because those terms were fair," she said. "The 8% I got him up to was not in the original terms." "No," he said, "but it should have been." He paused. "You're good at this." "I know I am," she said, without false modesty, because she had earned the knowledge of her own competence the same way she had earned everything else, through work, and she did not see the point of pretending otherwise. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had seen before and still could not quite name, something that was warm and careful at the same time, and then he looked back at the saddle leather in his hands and said, "Thomas asked me again this morning if I was staying forever." She went still. She said, "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know," he said. "Which is the truth." He paused. "I thought you should know he's asking." She looked at him in the dim, warm light of the barn, the smell of hay and horse and leather around them, and she thought about all the things she had been not saying for the past 2 months, the careful distance she had kept, the walls she had maintained not out of dislike but out of self-protection, out of the knowledge that grief does not simply end because time passes, and that a person can be grateful and drawn and still not ready. She said, "I haven't stopped thinking about what you told me in the courthouse. That you want somewhere to ride toward instead of just ride." He put the saddle oil down. He was very still. She said, "This land is something I have put my life into. Thomas is my life. I'm not the same woman I was before Robert, and I don't pretend to know exactly who I am right now, 4 months out from the worst thing that has ever happened to me." She paused. "But I know what I see every morning when I come out of that house, and you have already made the stove hot and the water cleared, and you are working this land like it matters to you. And I know what I see every evening when you teach my son something, and watch him figure it out like it is the most important thing you have ever done." He was looking at her now with such complete attention that she felt it like a warmth. She said, "I am telling you that I see it. I am not yet saying more than that because I need you to understand that I will not be hurried." "I know," he said. "I'm not hurrying." "Then we understand each other," she said, and she turned to go and then turned back and said, "Thank you for all of it, for coming here." He said, "There is nowhere else I would rather be, Mrs. Holloway." She went back to the house, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the late afternoon light, her hands on the counter, and she thought about Robert, with all the love and grief and complexity that thinking about him always brought. And she thought about this man in her barn who was patient and good, and who had walked through a courthouse door and changed her life. And she understood that both things could be true at the same time, that grief does not cancel out the possibility of something living, and that Robert, who had been a generous man with a capacity for faith, would have understood that. December came, and with it cold nights and the particular dry cold of the Arizona Territory in winter, nothing like the brutal cold of Kansas, but enough to require fires in the evening and extra hay for the horses and the cattle. And the work of the ranch took on the specific quality of winter work, more urgent and more interior, more oriented toward maintenance and survival than toward growth. Wesley had been building something in the barn in the evenings. She had heard the sound of it for 2 weeks before she asked what he was making, a slow, patient sound of wood and tool, and he had said he was making Thomas a Christmas present, and she had looked at him and said only, "All right." It was a rocking horse. She saw it on Christmas morning, when Thomas came out of the house in the early dawn to find it standing in the middle of the parlor with a red ribbon tied around its neck, a solid, beautifully made thing of smooth pine, with a mane of real horsehair and a saddle leather seat. And Thomas looked at it for a full 10 seconds in perfect silence, and then turned and ran back through the house and out the back door in his nightclothes. And Stella watched from the parlor window as he ran across the yard to the bunkhouse and hammered on the door until Wesley opened it, sleep-rumpled and blinking, and Thomas told him something with tremendous urgency that Stella couldn't hear, and Wesley laughed. A real, full, unguarded laugh, and it carried all the way across the yard through the cold morning air to where Stella was standing at the window with her hand over her mouth. She had not heard him laugh before. Not like that. She stood with her hand over her mouth and let herself feel what she was feeling, because she had promised herself she would not run from it once she recognized it, and she recognized it. She loved him. Not in the way she had loved Robert, which had been the slow, deep, rooted love of years and work, and a shared building of a life. That kind of love had its own territory, and she would not diminish it by comparison. But this was real, and it was its own thing, alive in her chest like a warm ember, and she stood by the window in the morning light and let herself know it. The question was what to do with the knowing. She did not do anything immediately, which she thought was right. There was a difference between knowing your own heart and acting on it, and acting on it required more than just knowing. It required being sure that what she was feeling was not the particular vulnerability of grief, not the gratitude of a woman who had been helped at her most desperate moment, but something genuine and durable that would hold up under the clear light of the ordinary days that followed extraordinary ones. She watched herself for 3 weeks, testing it the way she would test a fence line, applying pressure to see if it held. She paid attention to how she felt in the morning when she heard him moving in the yard, how she felt in the evenings on the porch, how she felt when he disagreed with her, which he did occasionally and directly, about the best way to manage the herd through a dry spell, about whether to sell the younger steers now or wait for the spring price. And she noticed that the disagreements did not disturb what she felt, that the feeling held up under the weight of ordinary friction and disagreement, and the specific intimacy of 2 people running something together. It held. She knew what she knew. In January, she rode out to Robert's grave for the first time since Wesley had come. She went alone on a cold, clear morning, and she stood by the cross under the bare cottonwood tree, and she talked to Robert the way she sometimes did, quietly, without embarrassment, because she did not think speaking to the people you had loved and lost was foolishness. She thought it was just a way of keeping the connection alive. She told him about the land, that it was safe. She told him about the courthouse, the whole story, and she thought she heard him laugh a little at the part where Wesley walked in and said what he said. She told him about Thomas and the rocking horse and the rope lesson, and the way Thomas had started to walk slightly differently, with a particular set to his small shoulders that she recognized as the beginning of the self-possession that came from having someone who believed in you. She told him about Wesley, everything she thought and felt, in plain terms, without softening it. She told him about the feeling that had been growing in her for months, how it was different from what she had had with Robert, how she understood that nothing was the same twice, and that was not a failure but a truth. She was quiet for a while after she said all of that. Then she said, "I think you would have liked him. I think you would have gone to the barn together and talked about horses for 3 hours and come in for supper smelling like hay. I think you would have trusted him." The cottonwood branches moved in the winter wind, a dry, gentle sound, and the sky was that deep, impossible blue overhead. And Stella stood there and let the grief be what it was. And then she set it down gently beside the cross and kissed her hand and pressed it to the cold wood and walked back to the house. That evening on the porch, when the coffee was done and the night was very quiet and the stars were unbelievably close and clear the way they were in the high desert in winter, she said his name. "Wesley." He looked at her. She said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to just listen until I'm done." He turned slightly toward her, the full attention that was characteristic of him, and waited. She said, "I have been alone for 5 months. I have been grieving for 5 months. And I have also been watching you, the way you work this land and the way you are with Thomas and the way you listen, and the way you tell me the truth even when it's not what I want to hear. And I have been being honest with myself about what I feel, which is something I promised myself I would always do." She looked at him steadily. "I care for you," she said, "more than a woman cares for a ranch hand. More than I expected to, more than I was prepared for. I am telling you this because I think you should know it, and because I have been a widow long enough to understand that there is no correct amount of time to wait before you allow yourself to feel something, and because I am tired of not saying what is true." He was very still. She said, "I am also telling you that I am not ready to be swept anywhere. I am still standing in my own grief. I am still figuring out who I am by myself, without a husband to define my days. I am telling you what I feel because you deserve to know it, not because I am asking you for anything or offering anything in return, not yet." He said, in a voice that was very quiet, "Stella." It was the first time he had used her first name. He said, "I rode from Tucson to Harlan in 2 days flat because a young man told me a stranger needed help. And I told myself it was just because I knew Drummond's type and I wanted to do right. But when I walked into that courtroom and I saw you standing there alone with those papers laid out in front of you and your jaw set and your voice steady and every man in that room against you, I knew that wasn't all of it." He looked at her with the full honesty that was the most consistently startling thing about him. "I have thought about you every day since then," he said. "I told you I came here to work as a hand and I meant it, and I would have gone on meaning it for as long as you needed me to, because I am not a man who pushes himself into spaces he hasn't been invited into. But you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I have been sitting on this porch every evening trying very hard not to be in love with you, and I am not succeeding." The word love sat in the cold night air between them, real and warm. Stella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told you I'm not ready to be swept anywhere." "I know," he said. "I'm also not asking you to wait indefinitely." "I wouldn't call this waiting," he said. "I'd call this being exactly where I want to be." She looked at him for a long time, and the stars were very close and the night was very quiet and the land around them was dark and vast and hers, and she said, "Then stay." "I'm staying," he said. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, which was warm and rough and real, and held it for a moment and then let go and picked up her coffee cup, and they sat together in the quiet and looked at the stars. That winter was hard in the way that winters on a working ranch are hard. A constant management of cold and scarcity, and the small emergencies that arrive without announcement. A section of fence went down in a windstorm in February, and 3 steers got out onto the Drummond Range, which required a conversation with Drummond's foreman, a taciturn man named Pike, that was managed with careful politeness on both sides, and resulted in the return of the steers without incident, which Stella took as a sign that Drummond had decided to let the land matter drop, at least for the moment. She filed a formal notice of the deed correction with the Territorial Land Office in Prescott in January, which produced a confirming letter in February that she framed and put on the wall of the parlor, beside a photograph of herself and Robert that had been taken in Tucson 2 years before he died. She stood before both of them and felt the particular complicated satisfaction of a fight one, which is never quite pure satisfaction because of everything it cost, but is real. Wesley noticed the framed letter and did not comment on it, but she saw him look at it when he came in for supper the next evening, and the quality of his expression was something she had come to recognize as the specific look of a man who is glad something happened. Spring arrived in the high desert with a particular drama, the wildflowers erupting from the red rock as if the entire landscape had been holding its breath all winter, and the cattle were fat and settled, and the grass along the creek was deep, and the work of the ranch expanded again into the open, airy quality of spring work, all potential and forward motion. On an evening in late March, when the air had that first smell of true warmth in it and the sky was going orange and rose and deep blue all at once over the western mountains, Stella came out onto the porch and found Wesley standing at the porch railing looking at the sunset, and she stood beside him and looked too, and the beauty of it was the kind that made you feel almost sad because you couldn't hold it. She said, "Wesley." He said, "Stella." She laughed a little. She said, "I was going to say something." "Say it," he said. She said, "I think you should know that I stopped grieving last Tuesday." He looked at her. "I don't mean I stopped loving Robert," she said, "or that I've stopped missing him. I mean the grieving, the part that was making everything dark around the edges. I think it's done. I think I'm on the other side of it." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, "How does that feel?" "Like the first morning after a long, cold winter," she said. "Like this." She gestured at the sunset. "Everything at once." He turned toward her fully and said, "What do you want, Stella?" She had been waiting for him to ask her directly, and she answered directly. She said, "I want to build something with you. This land, Thomas, a life. I want to do it honestly and clearly, not on the basis of what you said in that courthouse, which was a lie, but on the basis of what we've actually built here over these months, which is real." He said, "Then I want the same thing." She said, "I should tell you that the situation with the courthouse is something I've been thinking about. You told a judge I was your wife. I let you. That's a legal complication that we should eventually deal with." "I know," he said. "I would like to deal with it in the most straightforward possible way," she said, "which I think you understand." He looked at her steadily and said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Stella Holloway?" She considered this for a moment and then said, "I think I might be." He said, "Then yes. If that is what you want, then yes." She laughed again, a real laugh, clear and genuine, and it felt so different from the laughter of 4 months ago, when she had pressed her lips together outside the courthouse trying to contain it. That laugh had been the startled laugh of a woman caught off guard by her own feelings in the middle of a crisis. And this was the full laugh of a woman who was happy, and she let it go completely. He smiled at her, that warm, full smile, and she thought of the morning on Christmas Day when she had heard him laugh from across the yard, and how that laugh had undone something in her. And she reached up and put her hand on his jaw, the jaw with the small scar along the edge, and he covered her hand with his. And she kissed him in the middle of the sunset with the wildflowers coming up through the red rock all around and the cattle moving in the far pasture and Thomas asleep in the house behind them. And it was exactly right. They were married in Harlan in April, in the office of the circuit judge who came through the territory every 2 months, a straightforward and unambiguous judge named Harrington who had no connection to Drummond, and who performed the ceremony with a matter-of-fact warmth that Stella appreciated. Mabel Greer was there, and Ernesto Reyes, who had ridden up from Tucson when he received the letter, which meant they had to spend a portion of the evening before the wedding explaining to Ernesto in full detail that his action in telling Wesley about Stella's situation had resulted in considerably more than he had probably intended, and Ernesto's face had gone through an extraordinary sequence of expressions concluding in pure delighted vindication. Thomas wore his best shirt and stood very seriously beside Wesley during the ceremony with the posture of a person entrusted with an important duty, which was exactly how Stella had described it to him when she told him what was happening. "This is an important thing," she had said, "and your job is to be there and to be yourself." And he had taken this instruction with great seriousness and was doing it perfectly. Afterward, walking out of the courthouse into the April sunshine with her hand in Wesley's, Stella thought about the last time she had stood on these steps, 6 months ago, with a satchel full of papers and a jaw set against the whole world. And she thought about the strange and specific way that life turns on single moments, on a door opening, and a voice saying something impossible that changes everything. She said quietly so only he could hear, "You know, for 6 months I have been meaning to ask you something." "What is that?" he said. "On that first day," she said, "when you walked in and said you were my husband, were you nervous?" He laughed. He said, "Terrified." "You did not look it. Years of trail work," he said. "You learn not to show it." She squeezed his hand and said, "Well, it was convincing." "It needed to be," he said. "You had a lot riding on it." She thought of that room, Drummond's cold, flat stare, Ferris's quick eyes, Judge Colt's cautious calculation, and herself standing alone at that table with her papers laid out and her voice steady and no one in her corner, and then the door and the boots and a voice she had never heard before saying, "I'm her husband," with the simple conviction of a man telling the complete truth. She said, "I never thanked you properly for that." He said, "You married me. I think that covers it." Mabel Greer, walking a few steps behind them with Thomas's hand in hers, said to Thomas in a tone of complete satisfaction, "I told your mama he was worth keeping." Thomas said, with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has absorbed more of adult life than anyone realizes, "I knew that when he fixed the rocking horse the second time." Stella looked back at him. "The second time," Thomas said with mild surprise at her ignorance, "when the ear came loose in February. He fixed it that same night." "He didn't tell you." She looked at Wesley. Wesley said, looking at the sky, "It was a small repair." She held his gaze for a moment, thinking of the darkness of February, the cold and the hard work and the grief that was still close then, and this man in the lamplight of the bunkhouse after everyone was asleep, fixing a 6-year-old's rocking horse because the ear had come loose, telling no one. She said, "You are a good man, Wesley Maddox." He looked at her with a warmth so unguarded that it made something in her chest go very quiet and full, and he said, "I'm working at it." The summer of 1883 was the best summer Stella could remember in years, and she had known good summers. The cattle did well. The crew's arrangement held and expanded, and by August they had sold half the herd at prices that left her sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger book doing calculations that kept coming out better than expected. Wesley negotiated a shared fence agreement with the rancher on the eastern border, a decent man named Aldred, that solved a problem they had been managing individually for years. Thomas turned 7 and then 7.5 and grew 2 inches and learned to ride properly, not just sit on a horse but actually ride, and Wesley taught him with the same patient precision with which he did everything, and the boy took to it the way he took to everything he loved, with his whole self. In September, Stella told Wesley she was expecting. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, in the matter-of-fact direct way that was characteristic of her, because she was not a woman who performed announcements, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, a kind of undoing, the specific quality of a man receiving news so large that all the careful composure he normally maintained goes away for a moment, and what's underneath is just feeling, unguarded and real. He came around the kitchen table and took her face in both his hands and said, "Stella," she said. "I know," he said. Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I have done this before." "I know," he said. "I know you have." He held her face for another moment just looking at her, and she thought that of all the things she had loved about this man over the past year, this was the one she would point to, the particular quality of his attention when it was fully on her, the way he looked at her as if she was the most significant thing in his field of vision. She said, "Are you happy?" "Yes," he said. "God, yes. Are you?" She thought about it, actually thought about it with the honesty she brought to everything, because being happy when you have been through what she had been through was not a simple thing, and she did not want to offer him a simple answer when she had a real one. She said, "I am the happiest I have been since before Robert died. That's the truest thing I can say. And I'm not comparing, I'm just saying that this is real and it is good and it is mine. And yes, I am happy." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and she laughed against his chest. And outside the kitchen window, the September sun was coming up over the eastern mountains in long, slanted gold lines, and the horses were moving in the pasture, and somewhere in the house, Thomas was waking up and beginning the noisy business of the morning. Mabel Greer, when she heard, cried with a completeness and happiness that Stella found deeply affecting, and then immediately began planning a quilt. Drummond made one more attempt in October of that year. Not at the land, which he had apparently accepted was lost to him, but in the form of a rumor, carefully circulated through the Harlan business community, that Wesley Maddox was a fraud, a man with a manufactured history who had appeared out of nowhere and whose real name or real past no one could confirm. Stella heard about it from Ernesto Reyes, who had taken a job at the general store in Harlan, and who wrote to her with the particular loyalty of a young man who considered himself partly responsible for the happiness of two people he admired. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and thought about it for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to the Abilene Chronicle in Kansas, explaining that she was trying to verify the history of a man named Wesley Maddox, who claimed to have grown up in Abilene and worked the cattle trade from Kansas to Arizona, and asking if anyone could confirm this history. She also wrote to the trail boss of the Rafter Cross outfit in Texas, whose name she had gotten from Wesley, and to a cattle buyer in Abilene named Garvey, whom Wesley had mentioned as someone he had worked with. The letters she received back were conclusive. 3 people in Abilene remembered Wesley Maddox and his family, including the circumstances of the land loss, which one correspondent described in terms that were almost exactly what Wesley had told her. The Rafter Cross Trail boss wrote a letter that was one of the most flattering character references Stella had ever read, describing Wesley as the best cowhand he had employed in 20 years, honest and capable, and someone whose word was worth the same as a signed contract. Garvey in Abilene wrote back within 2 weeks saying Wesley Maddox was as solid as a man could be, and that anyone saying otherwise was either mistaken or lying for purposes of their own. Stella took the letters to Harlan and gave them to Cecil Porter, the timid lawyer, who was no longer timid where Drummond was concerned, because he had watched what had happened in that courthouse in October of 1882 and had quietly reconsidered his calculation of who the riskier party to offend actually was. Cecil Porter made several copies of the letters and placed them with the appropriate parties, and the rumor about Wesley Maddox dried up and disappeared within a week, because that is what happens to lies when you put the truth directly in front of them. When she told Wesley what she had done, he was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't need to do that." "Yes," she said, "I did. Someone told a lie about you. I proved it was a lie. That's the same thing you did for me in a courthouse in October of last year." He looked at her and said with a quiet directness that cut through everything, "I love you, Stella," she said. "I know you do. I love you too." It was December of 1883 when their son was born. They had been expecting the baby to come nearer to Christmas, but the boy had his own schedule, which Stella suspected was characteristic, and he arrived on the 15th of December during a snowstorm that was unusual for the Arizona territory, and therefore felt, to the people in that warm kitchen, like a particular kind of announcement. Wesley sat with her through the whole of it, which was a long night, holding her hand and talking to her in the low, steady voice he used when things were hard, the same voice she had heard him use to calm a frightened horse or talk Thomas through a difficult thing, and she had never been more grateful for anything than she was for that voice in those hours. When it was over and the midwife, a calm, competent woman from Harlan named Mrs. Figueroa, placed the baby in Stella's arms, Stella looked down at the small red face and the dark hair, already thick, and felt the specific enormous love that you only know after you have been in the position of giving someone their first breath of air. She said, "He has your hair." Wesley was looking at the baby with that undone expression she had seen in September, and she thought it was a thing she would remember about him for the rest of her life, that specific quality of a man who is moved by real things and does not pretend otherwise. He said, "He is the most wonderful thing I have ever seen." Thomas appeared in the doorway in his nightclothes, having been awake through most of it in the care of Mabel Greer, and looked at his brother with the careful assessment of a 7-year-old who has been told something large is happening and is now trying to understand it. He said, "Is he staying?" Stella said, "Yes, he is definitely staying." Thomas came closer, step by careful step, and stood beside Stella's chair and looked at the baby with the face of a person looking at something they are going to have to figure out. And then the baby opened his dark eyes and looked directly at Thomas with the unfocused but definite attention of a newborn who is registering this new world, and Thomas's face changed. He said, softly, "Hello." They named him James Robert Maddox, James for no particular reason beyond that it was a good name, and Robert because there was a man whose name should be remembered, and whose grave was under the cottonwood tree by the creek, and whose land this was and always would be. Stella held both of her sons on the morning after the birth, James in her arms and Thomas pressed against her side, while Wesley sat on the edge of the bed with his hand over hers and Mabel Greer bustled efficiently in the kitchen making a noise that sounded very much like crying happily while frying bacon, and the snow was still falling outside the window in big slow flakes, and the fire was going in the hearth, and the land was white and quiet and entirely theirs. 2 years later, in 1885, they added a room to the house. Wesley and Thomas and the Aldred neighbor from the east and 2 men from the Ray's family, Hector and Ernesto both, spent 3 weekends building it out of adobe and timber, and Stella worked beside them for most of it, and the room was for James, who had graduated from the cradle to a small bed, and was already demonstrating at 2 years old a personality of significant determination and curiosity, and also because another baby was expected in the spring, which this time Stella suspected would be a girl, for reasons she could not entirely articulate but held with conviction. She was right. The girl arrived in April of 1885, born in the new room with its fresh adobe walls and the smell of timber still in the air. And she was placed in Wesley's arms first because Stella had planned it that way, had told Mrs. Figueroa to give the baby to her husband first, and she watched Wesley hold his daughter for the first time with a feeling in her chest that was too large for any single word she knew. They named her Clara Rose Maddox, Clara for the roan mare who had carried Stella to Harlan and back on the most important day of her life, and Rose because it was the name Wesley's mother had carried, and because it was a name that deserved to be carried forward. Clarence Drummond sold the Harlan Land and Cattle Company and left the territory in the spring of 1885, after a territorial investigation into land filing practices in Harlan County resulted in the removal of Harold Weeks from his position as county recorder and the quiet retirement of Judge Colt. The investigation had been initiated by a complaint filed jointly by 6 families who had lost land to Drummond's operations over the previous decade, a complaint that Hector Reyes had organized and that Stella had supported with documentation and testimony. It was not a complete justice, because complete justice in situations like this was a thing that rarely arrived, but it was the kind of partial justice that made the future better, and that was therefore worth the effort it took. When she heard that Drummond had gone, Stella was standing in the kitchen with James on her hip, James who was 2.5 and who had strong opinions about being put down that he expressed with significant volume. She received the news from Ernesto, who had ridden out from Harlan to tell her, and she stood for a moment with the specific feeling of a weight being lifted that you did not realize you had been carrying until it was gone. She said, "Good." Ernesto said, "The Reyes family got a letter this week. The county says there may be a process to recover the land. It is not certain." Stella said, "I will help however I can. Tell Hector to come talk to me." Ernesto stayed for dinner, which he always did when he rode out, and Wesley came in from the south pasture, and they all sat together at the table that was now crowded and loud and alive with children and food and conversation. Thomas doing most of the talking because he was 9 years old and had recently become interested in everything simultaneously. James adding commentary from his chair in the form of sounds that may or may not have been words, and little Clara asleep in her basket by the stove. After dinner, Ernesto looked around the table with an expression of quiet, genuine satisfaction and said, "I think I did a good thing, telling Wesley about you." Stella said, "You absolutely did not let that go even once in 3 years." "I will not let it go ever," Ernesto said cheerfully. "I told a tired cowboy about a stubborn woman, and now there are 3 children and a working ranch, and Drummond is gone. I should be very proud." Wesley said, "You should be moderately proud and buy your own land." Ernesto said, "I am working on it." He was, in fact, working on it. By the following year, he had filed a homestead claim on 40 acres south of the Holloway Ranch, which put him close enough to be a neighbor, and he worked it while continuing his job at the general store. And Stella and Wesley helped him through the initial proving up the way that good neighbors do, with labor and knowledge and the occasional shared meal. On the evening of their 3rd wedding anniversary, in April of 1886, Stella and Wesley sat on the porch in the same way they had always sat on the porch, with coffee, with the land dark and quiet and vast around them, and the stars brilliant overhead in the clear Arizona sky. Thomas was inside doing his schoolwork by the lamplight, a serious boy who had developed a particular love of mathematics that made his mother deeply happy. James was asleep after a day that had apparently required the full energy of a 3-year-old boy, which was a remarkable quantity. Clara was nursing and then sleeping in Stella's arms, warm and small. Wesley looked at the baby in her arms and then at Stella, and she looked back at him across the porch in the way that needed no comment. The look of 2 people who have built something together out of hard work and honesty, and a love that had come to them in an unexpected form through an unexpected door. She thought about what it would have looked like from the outside that day in October of 1882. A widow alone at a county courthouse with a satchel full of papers and no one on her side, standing against a man who had all the advantage and intended to use it. The kind of story that ends with the widow going home with nothing, the land lost, the grave disturbed, and then a door opening. She looked at Wesley now, in the lamplight falling from the parlor window, and thought about all the things that had had to happen for this moment to exist. Ernesto Reyes having a brother named Hector who lost his land and who talked about it to anyone who would listen. A tired cowboy in a Tucson saloon who listened. A horse named Cinder that could be ridden hard for 2 days. A courthouse door that opened at exactly the right moment. All of it improbable, all of it real. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her. He said, "The day I walked into that courtroom." "I was thinking about the same thing," she said. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "When I said it, were you afraid?" She considered this honestly. She said, "No, I was calculating. I was figuring out what it meant and what it would cost and what happened if I corrected you. And then I decided not to." "Best decision you ever made," he said, with a slight smile. "One of them," she said. "The decision to let you stay was also significant. And the decision to ask me to marry you." "You asked me," she said. "I asked you if you were asking me," he said. "That's technically different." She laughed, and Clara stirred slightly at the sound, and Stella held her a little closer, and the baby settled again, and the stars were very close, and the night was very quiet, and the land around them was dark and enormous and entirely, legally, provably, irrevocably theirs. She said, "I am glad the door opened when it did." He said, So am I every single day. The cottonwood tree by the creek rustled in a night wind, the same sound it made every night, the sound Robert had loved, the sound that Stella had heard every night for 7 years now, first with grief, and then with something that gradually became the complex, layered piece of a life lived fully and honestly, with all its losses held alongside all its loves, neither diminishing the other. The horses moved quietly in the pasture. The fire was still warm in the hearth. Inside the house, Thomas put down his pen and looked out the window at his parents on the porch, and then went back to his mathematics. James slept deeply in his small bed in the new room. Clara breathed evenly in her mother's arms, and Wesley reached across the space between them and took Stella's hand, and she held it in both of hers, and the night was wide open and full, and the land went on and on under the stars, and everything that mattered was right where it should be.